Welcome everybody. Helle Bang-Jorgensen here from Global Compact Network Canada. It's 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12 noon in Vancouver or in that time zone, and we are about to start our webinar about the STG survey 2017, the Sustainable Development Goal survey. And I can tell you all, you're in for a treat. We are actually a little bit surprised of the results, but let me get into all of that. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today, and you might have had a chance to actually download the survey results. Maybe not. I will take you through some of these, and then we'll have a discussion. But let me first start with how to use the control panel. You should all be muted from this end, and then we will unmute you. But in terms of asking a question, you can raise your hand. There's a little place where you can, the icon where it says click the icon to raise your hand, and then we will unmute you when we get to the question and answer session. You can also send us your questions in the box that we have also on the page. So with that, also in terms of the agenda, again, we have the welcome that I'm doing right now. I will then be going through some of the results from the survey. There's more than we can do this for this 1.5 hours, but again, I will encourage you all to download the survey and read it. Many interesting results. Then we will have remarks from our two great panelists, DRI Kent and Doug Beaver, and I will give you their bios in a second, and then of course at discussion. I think this is the welcome. So let me just start by again welcoming both all of you, but also of course our panelists. So as you see here, we have DRI Kent. DRI Kent is the Director General for Development Policy within Global Affairs Canada, and responsible for the advancement of strategic development policy and emerging issues, including the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development, so the Sustainable Development Goals. And since joining the Foreign Service in 1994, DRI's career has focused on multilateral diplomacy, including international development policy, peace and security issues, and human rights. And DRI and I have had the chance to be out speaking at different events about the Sustainable Development Goals. So also there you're in for a treat. Then the next we have here in the middle, I'm going to say the man in the middle, but let me just stop with that right now and say we have Doug Beaver. Doug joined Acronym in 1987 and has held several roles of increasing responsibility, including manager, marketing services, senior director, corporate relations, and current role is the senior director of sustainability and stakeholder relations. Doug is responsible for Acronym's government relations and corporate social responsibility strategy and initiatives, and is great supporter, a visionary supporter of the Global Compact Network Canada, and an SDG hero, where Doug also have an app that he has promoted a lot in that regard. I know we had Elisa Goldberg, the ADM, the Assistant Deputy Minister, but Elisa was unable, unfortunately, to join us in our webinar today. But I'm quite sure Deidre will be able to cover everything in that regard. So with that, let me just then say that let me start by telling you about the Sustainable Development Goals and our SDG survey 2017. And I think most of you on this webinar knows this, but just to make sure that we are on the same page. So not in 19, but in 2015, all 193 member states of the United Nations adopted a plan for achieving a better future for all, laying out a path until 2030 to end extreme poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and protect our planet. The Sustainable Development Goals have been negotiated at the UN with widespread public input, including significant involvement by companies participating in the UN Global Compact, which you know, all of you, the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. So the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals means that businesses, as well as all of us, now have a globally accepted and practical, actionable definition of sustainable development and a roadmap for mutual success. It's been going a lot of discussions into landing on these 17 goals, and I'm so pleased to see the the uptake of the Sustainable Development Goals worldwide, and of course, especially also in terms of here in Canada. So, in terms of the sorry, in the late, give me a second. Sorry, sorry all. So in late 2015, the Global Compact Network Canada conducted a survey to understand how stakeholders, Canadian stakeholders, from the private sector, civil society and others perceive the Sustainable Development Goals. I will say Sustainable Development Goals and STG is kind of like, but you know, when I say STG, it is the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also want to see how we could inspire increased levels of participation to achieve the goals. That was kind of like a call out from the Secretary General of the UN, asking the UN Global Compact and the local networks to advance the Sustainable Development Goals within the different countries. And I have to say, at that point, it was when I said Sustainable Development Goals, people looked at me and said, what? And when some said, well, we have the Millennium Development Goals and that's only for developing countries. And I said, nope, the Sustainable Development Goals now is the new Agenda 2030, and that is for us all. So I believe that the survey that we did in 2015, or we populated in 2016, generated a large number of very insightful responses, which help Canadian businesses, the government, I think, and civil society organizations to identify opportunities to strategically adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. We also very successfully, I should say, together with Global Affairs, conducted a national roundtable on the role of the private sector in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was based on the findings from our report that I will just delve into a little bit now. So if we look at our questions, that we have had the same questions both last year, so 2016 or 2015, 16, and in 2017. We asked the participants to rank the top 5 Sustainable Development Goals, the priorities, in accordance to what were the most important issues within Canada that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively. Then we asked, what are the most important issues in the world that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively? Then we asked, what of the existing initiatives in your organization, what are you already doing in terms of integrating the Sustainable Development Goals? And last but not least, we asked, what do you see being the most important Sustainable Development Goals for your business or organization? And bear in mind that when we set this out in 2015, the goals were just being kind of like, well, they were not even adopted at that point, but just out there. So we basically put in front of a lot of people that did not know anything about the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, and asked them to prioritize. So what then happened was that we got the results, and let me just show you the results from last year. So this is from the 2016. I will come to the 2017 very shortly. So this earlier survey, again, we attempted to understand how Canadian stakeholders from the private sector, civil society, and others perceive the Sustainable Development Goals, and how we, as the Global Compact Network Canada, could inspire increased levels of participation to achieve the goals. And again, we got a lot of insightful responses, and as many of you know, we have then, during the last year and more, had several events about the Sustainable Development Goals. We have working groups, we have workshops, etc. And all of that is fantastic to see the uptake of the Sustainable Development Goals within Canada. So again, if we look at these results from last year, you'll see that clean energy is at the top, priorities for Canada. Thereafter, decent work and economic growth. If we look at the second, so issues in the world, we actually had there 50% of respondents ranked no poverty or zero hunger as the first issue to tackle in the world. But look at the list and see if you see zero hunger and no poverty in the first line issues within Canada. They are not, but bear that in mind. So we also saw that more than 50% of respondents ranked decent work and economic growth as one of the most important SDGs for their business. So bear in mind top one there, SDG number 8. And 60% actually talked about in one way or another climate action, but as you see, climate action was top 4 and 5, and nothing within what's existing initiative in your company. And the last thing, perhaps just to kind of like take one of those that did not, you do not see on the list here, peace, justice, and strong institution. 2% ranked that among the most important SDGs for their business or as a priority of existing initiatives. So all that to say, bear this in mind, and then we go to the 2017. So in this 2017 survey, we again, of course, wanted to understand the potential changes in the prioritization of the SDGs since the 2016-2015 survey, and to paint a picture of the actions that the Canadian businesses and not-for-profit communities, etc., is taking and planning to take in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2017 Sustainable Development Goals survey also explored Canadian organizations' appetite for intra- and inter-sectoral collaboration. In total, we have 134 representatives from 36 different industries from across Canada participate in the survey. And that is actually an increase of 168% over the volume of responses from last year. So that kind of tells us that the awareness of the SDGs in Canada is actually increasing, and we know that from all the work we do with the Global Compact Network Canada participants. There's a lot of work going on. Similar to last year, the majority of the respondents were based in Ontario, 63%, remaining are respondents based in Alberta, 15%, BC 13%, Quebec 9%, and then I think we're missing a few provinces, but hopefully next year. So private and public companies represent 26% and 18% this year's response of this year's respondents. And it's worth noting that not-for-profit and non-governmental organizations made up actually now a larger point, like 36%, compared to 10% last year. So this again showcased the rising interest in engaging on the SDGs by the non-governmental organization or not-for-profit and civil society organizations. So we clearly appreciate the uptake and the help in terms of encouraging all organizations to explore and pursue the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an agenda that's going to take us all to work together. So it's very, very great to see the uptake from all sectors. All right, I think I kept you waiting long enough. Let's look at the results. And if you could remember that the results from last year for issues within Canada, we started with clean, affordable and clean energy was number 1 last year, and then we had decent work in economic growth at number 2, and reduced inequalities in number 3, and etc. And climate action last year was number 5. So if you look at this year's result, it's changed a lot. And so in the first question, participants in the survey were, as you said, asked to indicate the 5 most important issues within Canada that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively. And as you see, the first priority for this question was climate action, and that was also ranked among the top priorities for all the other 3 questions you'll see in a minute. So both issues in the world, existing initiatives, and important issues for your company. Again, in last year, it was totally different picture that we saw. In terms of sustainable, or the SDG number 1, survey data indicates no poverty as a key issue for Canadians, and our findings shows that Canadians are concerned and want to take action on poverty by identifying the SDG 1 as the second highest priority, actually just slightly behind SDG 13, climate action, both domestically, so within Canada, and as you will see in a second, also globally. So that's a very interesting development from last year. Also, the SDG 8, so decent work and economic growth. That's this year the 3rd highest priority, which serves as a catalyst for, we think, also poverty reduction. So no poverty, decent work and economic growth being the 2nd and 3rd priorities respectively, might indicate that Canadians are actually honing in on low-income citizens to be a larger beneficiaries of increased economic growth in 2017. Again, this is us looking at the data, but in order for Canadians to see economic growth and poverty reduction at the same time here, the lower end of the income distribution could indicate that we'll have to benefit from the growth as well. Then perhaps also surprisingly, SDG 11 and 12 also made it to the top priorities, where last year they were not on the priority list. So responding Canadians seems to be prioritizing sustainable cities and communities as a key focus area. One potential reason for this could be that Canada is once again the fastest growing economy according to G7 and the Statistics Canada, and so this means that a rising population in our biggest cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and the growing realization of importance for Canada to invest in the necessary infrastructure to actually accommodate growing cities. Transit infrastructure projects could present a potential, economic efficiencies, reduce the level of CO2 emissions by limiting the time individuals spend in their cars. So the large cities such as Toronto, Vancouver would also benefit from affordable housing projects, etc. Again, the last one here, and I'm just looking at the clock, and I better hurry up. SDG 12 was identified as the 5th highest priority by Canadians for issues within Canada. So again, this indicates rising levels of awareness as well as concerns surrounding our consumption habits and growing waste and its impact on the environment. So the private sector is also responding to these concerns, which is evident by seems rise of concepts such as circular economy, etc., sharing economy, and so on. So let me then go to the next line we have here. As you see, issues in the world and issues within Canada seems to be climate action and no poverty, which just remind you about the 2016 results. We had zero hunger as number 1 in the world and no poverty as number 2. So no poverty stayed, but we are going for climate action had gone from 4th priority in the world to now be number 1. Again, I think what's interesting here is clearly what's happening in terms of the prioritization, but also the alignment in terms of issues within Canada and issues in the world. And to me, that says something about that Canadians that responded to this survey start to see that this is not about the developing world or the developed world. This is about our world, and this is about what is it that important both within our own borders as well as on a global scale, and that all of that are interrelated. I'm just going to jump to then existing initiatives in your company, and again, I have to say I'm a little bit not surprised because I know how much that companies are working, but when we compare to last year, the existing initiative in the company was number 1, decent work and economic growth. See, that's taking now a 4 priority. Then the second was quality education, the same as this. Then we had infrastructure and reduced inequalities, etc. last year. So this year, gender equality being the most acted on sustainable development goals in 2017 compared to last year, where it did not appear in the top 5 of any of the 4 categories. And again, this is very interesting to hear. Also, especially, it's exciting because we have, as many of you know, the Gender Equality Forum 2017 coming up, where we will set an agenda for accelerated action on the SDG number 5, gender equality. And just a little plot for that. So the speakers includes actually the Honourable Minister for Status of Women, the Canada's ambassador to the UN, the director for the award-winning film Equal Means Equal, ambassador from the EU, a lot of more very, very both high-level and very extremely great presenters and speakers in terms of tackling how do we accelerate action on gender equality. Again, we see that climate action, it remains at the top priority for Canadians across the both on domestic and international levels in 2016 and 17. And globally as well as in Canada, there's been as you know, a growth in the corporate initiatives supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement, and many of our Canadian participants also signed up to the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition upon the push. Now I shouldn't perhaps not saying that, but we got a request from the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and I'm pleased to see many of the Global Compact Network Canada participants taking an active role. And perhaps last but not least on this, the SDG 9, investment in infrastructure and innovation, is crucial drivers for economic growth and development. So the technology progress is also key to finding lasting solutions to both economic and environmental challenges, such as providing new jobs, promoting energy efficiency, sustainable industries, and of course also investing in scientific research and innovation, so we can facilitate sustainable development and scaling in that regard. Then last line but not least here are issues for your company. So here participants were asked which of the SDGs were most important to their organizations. And gender equality and climate action tied for the first spot, but at the same time it's also interesting to see the similarity between the SDGs which appear in this category with those from the existing initiative category. So there's a slight difference. Well, one of them are what are we working on right now and what should we be working on. And as you see, gender equality is taking the first spot in both. So it signals that Canadian organizations are actually acting on the issues that they also say is most important, which is a great thing. And it's kind of like saying what might be coming up next in that regard, including responsible consumption. So we know that gender issues also stretch to the economic facet in Canada, because Canada is actually below on the OECD average for the share of women in leadership positions. In addition, according to a report from Statistics Canada, Canadian women who work full-time will earn 73.5 cents for every dollar men makes. So these numbers are even lower for Indigenous women and women of color. These are the themes that we also will be exploring at the Gender Equality Forum in April with both the representatives for women in leadership, and I should say Senator Sinclair will also be there in terms of also discussing in Indigenous people. So again, if I look back, so gender equality did not appear in the top 5 priorities last year. So this is definitely a big signal in terms of what it is that Canadians are focusing on now. Then let me see if I can go to perhaps just very briefly talk about what is missing. So one thing is that we see all of these, and if we look here, so Sustainable Development Goals number 6 and 7, that was got the fewest votes, was last year as well, life below water and life on land, as well as the partnerships for the goals, so 17. However, the SDGs, and I think this is important, are they are as set, and it's not like a menu, even though we have like priorities saying focus on which one are the best, most relevant for the company, and where it is that the company is impacting or being impacted. But for instance, the SDG number 14 and 15 are both strongly related to SDG 13 on climate action, and of course SDG number 12, responsible consumption and production, where that both ranked high. Another thing is peace, justice, and strong institutions, so SDG 16, also received very few votes in all the questions, where it was ranked on kind of like average. Some of the targets of these goals include issues of transparency, anti-corruption, promotion of rule of law, that I believe everybody will say, okay, that is the foundation for the rest. So I think, although it's important to know that the peace, justice, strong institution perhaps not are represented, it is of course the integral to achieve all the other SDGs. Then let me just kind of like tell you that we put a few other questions out this year. We asked questions to understand what steps that Canadian organizations are taking now where we are in 2017, so it's a year in, and what are the state of collaboration between industries and different stakeholders. As you all know, I believe that this is not something you do all by yourself. This is something where if we can scale, if we can collaborate, if we can really, then we can make 1 + 1 become much more than 2. And I know that the participant of the Global Compact Network Canada does agree with me in that regard. So let's just look at very quickly at the results for that. So in the survey we asked what steps is your organization taking to achieving the SDGs, and we are very excited to see that almost all of our respondents have stated to take action. We see that 23% have already successfully aligned their business strategy with SDGs that are relevant to their organization, and additional 36% is in the process of doing this. We also see that our respondents are much less interested in aligning business strategies with all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and that's actually also what we, the Global Compact Network Canada, are suggesting to our participants and signatories in our STG working groups, etc. It's important that you know which of these SDGs are impacting your business. This is not the sustainability strategy, this is the strategy of the company, and which of the SDGs are you as a company impacting, because that's your risk, it's your opportunities. This is the opportunities for innovation, but it's also, as I said, the risk for not having the license to operate. So this is really, really strategic issues, and I'm talking to board of directors about this and really starting to take an understanding that this is not sustainability and a sustainability report, but this is an integral part of the company and the strategy and the long-term value creation, both within the company but for us all. So again, we're very happy to see that our survey respondents have adopted this approach towards achieving the goals. One area where Global Compact Network Canada will focus on to offer additional support might be is in the last box on the bottom right of the full screen, where it seems that the large minority of the surveyed organizations are very interested in improving their tools to track their progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, but very few have successfully done this. I think there's key to align this not only to what do within the business, but also from a government point of view, because Canada will have to report on what Canada is doing, and we should align that to what it is that also the companies are doing, as all the companies, all the organizations, all of us, you know, at the end make up Canada. So let's align that, and as many of you know, that is also what we are discussing when we have the delegation going to Ottawa and talking to ministers and ministries. Then the next here, in terms of the appetite for collaboration, again, very, very pleased to see this. That, as you all know, we engaged in dialogue with both the federal government and actually increasingly also provincial governments. And here also the Alberta, I'll give a shout out to Alberta, where I've been visiting more than a few times. And there are and will be many opportunities for businesses who are part of the Global Compact Network Canada to connect with both the federal and provincial governments. So our team here at this end continues to build and expand the relationships, and we hope that we will see a lot of private-public partnerships and also with not only business to and government, with NGOs, civil society organizations, and many of you on this call will know that we are convening, we are facilitating that dialogue. So we encourage collaboration efforts, and we embrace our role as a facilitator between and convener between the Canadian businesses and I was going to say all other actors, including, of course, the government. We also see that although SDG 17 Partnership for the Goals did not rank high in our 4 categories, there is, as you see, a large desire to collaborate with organizations and stakeholders where mandates are aligned closely with the priorities of your organization. So that might be another thing here, saying if you haven't started looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, now is a good time to start, because your business partners, your customers, your employees, and others might start to ask questions in that regard. And maybe I should kind of, like, as the last slide in that regard, say that of course we will have had this SDG Awards, so the Sustainable Development Goal Awards, that we had at Toronto Stock Exchange last year, and we're hoping to have similar awards this year. We have, as I was talking about earlier, the Sustainable Development Goals Workshops, and I have put in somebody saying drawing, is that a mistake? But it's not a mistake, the one with all the STGs, and it's Mark Osterman from SNC Lavalin that in one of our workshops, and he approved that we could put this in, said, okay, which one of the STGs are important for us, but how does that then interact with all of the other STGs? And we see in many of the workshops that we do that this is a brilliant way to get people to understand, not only just to focus on kind of the thing that's already in, but look at what is it that really are impacting the company now and in the future, and what is it that the company also, or the organization, can impact now and in the future, positive or negative. That is also something when, in terms of the board facilitation we do, we are now starting to also talk to investors and have investor company workshops in that regard, because investors taking a greater and greater interest in this. And I think that, yeah, as many of you know, when the investors also start asking questions, this is something, especially when we're talking about the proxy season coming up, that it's worth to be prepared on. The last part says here's STG Supplier Workshops. So think about the power of procurement, and I know that different companies and different actors are starting to look at how can we embed the SDGs into our hopes, our requirements for suppliers. And again, so we are doing STG Supplier Workshops where a company inviting their suppliers and then talk about what are the SDGs, why is it important, and what could be the expectations from the company, but also from the suppliers in that regard. And I think with that I should then go to the next part of the agenda, which is getting remarks from Deidre, Kent, but Deidre, I need to unmute you, so I'm trying to see if I can do that. Deidre, can you hear? Well, I can. Maybe you can hear me. Hopefully you can hear me. But can I hear you? I have unmuted you.
I hope you can hear me.
I can indeed. Deidre, do you want to give a few remarks?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the oversight, Helene, and for inviting me to today's discussion. Kudos to you and Global Compact Network Canada for your leadership in the survey, as well as convening today's discussion. I hope we're able to have some time left at the end for some questions and answers. It's remarkable to think it was only 18 months ago that the global community gathered in New York to endorse the global goals and to reset our approach to sustainable development. We do need to recall all countries and stakeholders pledged to work together to take new approaches to achieve the goals and the targets of the 2030 Agenda and fundamentally to leave no one behind. I'll also remind us all that it's universal, meaning it's developing and developed countries. It's Canada and the rest of the global community, and all stakeholders are expected to implement the agenda. So as our slide here says, it is comprehensive and it's integrated, and it demands that we do development differently, that we must examine what we do, where we do it, and who we do it with. So what has the Government of Canada been doing? Let me in my remarks touch on what we're doing here in global affairs to align to the 2030 Agenda, what the government is doing domestically, as well as some of our thinking on partnerships to achieve the 2030 Agenda, and then a few reflections on your survey. So the Prime Minister and the Minister for International Development and the Francophonie have reiterated Canada's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Last year, or last summer and through the last year, we've conducted really what we think is a once-in-a-lifetime review of Canada's international assistance and our policy, and looking at how our international assistance can shape our engagement and support for the 2030 Agenda. During the review, we had more than 15,000 people across more than 65 countries engage and participate in the review. We asked questions around not just the 2030 Agenda, but where can Canada make a difference? What are the needs? How does Canada need to change its approach to respond to a new global context? For those who are interested in looking at what we heard, there's a report online on the Global Affairs website called the What We Heard Report. It's our effort to be transparent and put out what we heard. There was broad support for the 2030 Agenda, for taking a feminist approach, being innovative, recognizing we need to be more nimble and do things differently. And that there is a key role for Canada to play in convening around the 2030 Agenda. We're still in the process of finalizing the results of the review. We hope to make our new international assistance policy public in the coming weeks. It will articulate Canada's contribution to the 2030 Agenda, and clearly the input we receive from a diversity of stakeholders, and Pele and the network were part of our consultations, and we did hear about the role the Government of Canada has to play, but also the diversity of Canadian stakeholders. So Canada will be refocusing its international assistance on helping the poorest and most vulnerable and supporting fragile states. The empowerment of women and girls and advancing gender equality will be at the heart of our international assistance. This we already know. And the review is not just about what we're doing, but how we do it. This will take some time, but the review through the new policy, Canada, the Government of Canada will need to be more innovative, more nimble, more collaborative, looking at different ways of partnering with different types of partners. In terms of our domestic implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, I see a lot of alignment between the priorities you've found through your survey. Clearly, climate action, no poverty, economic growth, and gender equality really emerged this year as areas of priority, but also areas of action inequality, growing the middle class, economic growth, creating a clean and strong environment, taking on climate change, investing in infrastructure, investing in children and youth, and fully consistent with the SDGs, the government's committed to a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, diversity, and partnership. This really gets at the heart of the meaning of the universal agenda and leaving no one behind. And also the 2016 to 2019 Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. This is developed by the Minister of Climate Change and Environment. This was released last October, and it sets aspirational goals that reflect the environment-related aspects of 12 of the SDGs and their related targets. At present, the government's working on the development of a very integrated approach to the SDGs that will reflect domestic and international activities. So partnership we see is at the heart of the 2030 agenda. It's a standalone goal 17, but given the integrated nature of the goals, it's cross-cutting also. The Global Compact Network and its members have an important role to play in achieving the SDGs. Different levels of government, business, the research community, foundations, civil society, citizens do all have a role to play in finding solutions to confronting the challenges of sustainable development. With our different strengths, knowledge, expertise, we can promote innovation and foster new partnerships to gain results. The Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation is a forum established in 2012. Just met in December in Nairobi. It's an inclusive, multi-stakeholder partnership that seeks to mobilize all stakeholders to achieve the global goals. In many ways, it's the how of achieving and the who in achieving the global goals. One of its key agendas is to monitor how development cooperation is being delivered at the national level, how it's being effective. So it's proving to be a valuable platform for mutual learning and collaboration. In December, Canada took on a leadership role within the Global Partnership. We became a member of the steering committee representing USA, Australia, and New Zealand. Julia Sanchez, head of the CCIC, also became a co-chair of the CSO partnership for development effectiveness. So the GPEDC's objective is to bring all stakeholders together to advance the SDGs. The private sector has a really important role to play in this effort. I'd like to hear from you how you see yourselves in this forum. I'd say last year there was room to grow. We would like to see greater participation of the private sector in this forum. It's a work in progress from both developing and developed countries. Another piece in terms of partnerships is work being done by our ambassador to the UN, Marc-André Blanchard, where he's co-led and started up a new initiative called the Group of Friends for SDG Financing. Its goal is to work with the private sector and take advantage of all sources of financing to support the SDGs. He really takes literally the challenge to tap the trillions required to achieve the SDGs. For example, he's seeing the pension funds and Canadian pension funds in particular as a group that we can work with to look at the links to achieving the SDGs. So lastly, just a few thoughts on the survey. The survey really is important. It's important to look at how Canadian companies and organizations see the SDGs. It it's truly impressive that 90% of the respondents are taking action to support the SDGs. It's really showing that the SDG message is resonating outside the UN and government circles. There does appear to be a growing recognition that the SDG, that the goals aren't standalone but are interconnected, such as goal number 1 on poverty, SDG 5 on gender equality, and on climate action. I'm wondering if next year we can include some questions around, specifically around partnerships, about who the respondents have been working on. I noticed that, or I was struck that the goal 17 on partnerships, as well as goal 16 on peace, justice, and governance, weren't, didn't receive a high degree of response. I mean, perhaps they're seen as overarching, but Hele, as you said, this is getting at the enabling environment for much of what the private sector wants to be doing, such as human rights and governance and challenges around corruption. So just to close off and to hear the next presentation by Doug and to have a discussion, I really do want to underline that we in global affairs and the government more broadly recognize that this agenda is our agenda, that we do need to work differently. I'm pleased to see the appetite to work with us, the private sector, civil society, Canadians, youth. There's a real opportunity to work with youth, and dialogues such as this really will be key to carrying the agenda forward. There's only 14 years left. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Deirdre. Yeah, only 14 years left. This is where we all should think about where are we and where are our children in 14 years, and what is the world we want them to live in, and ourselves. Before we get to questions, I want to make sure that, Doc, we also hear from you. And I know that you are already working in partnerships, etc. But why don't I let you, Doc, get on? I'll see if I can unmute you, and then I can mute Deirdre. Doc, I think you should be unmuted now. Doc, can you?
There, is that good?
Okay, now we can hear you. Good.
Well, thanks, Hella. Thanks, Deirdre. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of a lens on who AGRIM is, and then if it's okay, I'll run into a little bit of our approach in terms of more the how and the what as to how we view our actions and what we try to achieve through some solutions. And then if it's okay, Hella, I'll just hit a little bit on some of the value we see in that for different stakeholders, including ourselves. But before I get into the approach and the how and the what, let me talk a little about AGRIM just so you get a lens of who we are. We're a large multinational in our nature. We have about 1,400 retail stores that go right to the farmer that provide crop input supplies. So we're an agriculture company. So if you think about us through that lens, you'll have a pretty good idea what we do. We also manufacture some inputs, crop nutrients that help people grow crops. So it gives you an idea where we are. We do have our head office in Canada, so we are kind of focused on Canada, but we very much focus across the world in terms of our systems. And that kind of leads me to a little bit about our how. We really believe in a long-term approach that's got scalable systems, if you like, systems that can be wrenched not only on a project basis in one region, if we can be replicated or franchised in many cases around the world. And we'll talk about a couple of those, and hopefully they'll give some perspective. But those solutions that come out of these scalable pieces, we think by doing it that way, we can actually move the dial on the SDGs in a much more tangible way than we can if we do an isolated individual project. A bit of an example of what in that case would be our 4R system. We've worked with our industry now for probably, I'd say, 15 plus years to create one nutrient stewardship system that could be grown around the world, and that system is the 4R system. It actually developed out of Canada, but is now being used in the US, being used in South America, China, Russia, different areas around the world. It has a lot of scaling yet to be done, but is a basis for which we start to do some major solutions to the SDGs. One of them would be around something Deirdre mentioned, around poverty, food security. So it's a natural for us in SDG 1 and 2 that our nutrients are properly managed with on-the-ground, culturally appropriate groups, extending them, that we can make a major impact. So the 4R solution, we've been working in Kenya for a while. It helps on the first priorities of poverty, food security, but very quickly ripples into women empowerment 5, habitat, healthcare, education, a number of the things you saw in the survey that were on a world basis. In Canada, of course, we're less worried about food security because we're quite lucky because we have very good farmers and communities and it's there, but for most of the world, that's a priority. And it's not just a priority for food, but it's a priority relevant to getting the food they need, the money they need, and then that, of course, ripples through the whole SDG structure. The other side of that and the 4R structure is on climate that Deirdre mentioned. We see that as being one of the largest scalable systems that we can put in place to actually have an impact on reductions in climate change. We know there's losses of nitrous oxide related to some of our products. So by working with players in the value chain like Walmart's, Unilevers, and retailers and farmers, we can actually have megatons of carbon reduced through that 4R system. So again, that systematic approach that starts in Canada, but is now being used by value players across the US and internationally for either food security or climate or whatever that initiative might be. Moving a little bit more in terms of the shared value side, we see that as core and fundamental as to how we do anything. We know we can't do these things alone. You don't have the leverage as any one organization. Doesn't really matter how big you are. You just don't have the ability. It also, when you do large shared value structures, it does a couple things for you. It gives you reach. A lot of the NGO community governments have assets and abilities to reach people that we just can't do as a company. It also increases our credibility as an organization. We're a private business or a public business, but at the end of the day, by working with others, credibility, trust rises, and that increases our ability to do more and more out there. We also get great ideas. You'll come to the table with a system, and once you start to work with an NGO, you'll start to figure out how do we make a win-win on nutrient stewardship with riparian areas and catchment areas that create habitats and other opportunities on nitrous oxide reduction that could occur not only from the standpoint of agriculture on the farm side, but what can we do with the NGOs and the community working with adoption and other things. So that whole SDG 17 actually is almost paramount to anything we do in our systems. It's the foundation for everything we do in ours. And we'll hear in a second how we talk about some of those in the education side. We have probably over 200 NGO partners, so we just don't try that, but we seek the partnerships. You can't partner with everybody that doesn't always fit, of course, but at the end of the day, we find 95% of the time you can partner. There is opportunity, especially when you have a systematic approach that they can see and help create a space where they see value for themselves. So that's fundamental for us. I think the third how piece for us is on the measurement and improvement. We don't believe you need to get it perfect. You need to get a system that you can iteratively change, that you can do measurements on, and those measurements will guide you on the next round of improvement. Too often we try to be perfect and we don't start. So you need to have those demonstration projects, but more importantly, you got to get out there, try it in a few spots, improve it, and then scale it. The solution that we have for our solution that we're working in for smallholders, now we're working with government and other players to say, can we scale that now to 5 countries? Can we then scale it to 20 countries? And can we bring more partners in the NGO community that will help us do that? Can we work with the governments locally to actually start on an improved extension and proper support for those growers? So we find by measuring, we start to identify things that work, and then we work with those stakeholders to find ways to mitigate those problems. One other piece on the measurement side, we know the SDGs are out there, but there is another piece that's happening with the SDGs. People are developing measures. So one of the things our sector has been doing as we work on it, we just don't work on it as our company, but we work with our fertilizer sector around the world to say what are good measures to identify that we are making an impact on poverty, food security, on health of soils, on nitrous oxide reduction. So we work on those measures pretty actively. And then we start to work with the value chain to say how can we actually gather that, implement, and collect that information to show positive impacts. And that's one that you'll see with the two solutions I've mentioned now that was highlighted at Davos by the UN Global Compact, talking about how those solutions could actually have impacts that would have measurable, tangible reductions in terms of GHGs, and hopefully impacts on women empowerment, food security, and poverty on the 4R solution side. So at the end of the day, the value we see as a company on that, it's always changing, but for one, if you use that shared value partnership, it actually lowers your cost and increases the effectiveness of the solutions to mitigate risks, to actually make an impact in the SDGs, to make global improvements, so we don't have to have regional ones. It's perfect to have things that can be wrenched across the globe. It brings the stakeholders together to do that. The SDGs is beautiful from that standpoint. If you're an ag company like ours, how nice is it to have the first two being poverty and food security? It's right up our alley. The solution mitigates some risks. I mean, there's no doubt all of us have risks that we have to deal with in our companies. We work with stakeholders. We identify those. In our case, climate change, nutrients in the environment. Those are all risks that we use now solutions that work within the SDGs to mitigate those risks and work with stakeholders to impact them in a positive way. So there is a value, and every company is doing that. The other side of it is solution creates new product opportunities, markets. If you develop solutions, you may be moving your product lines and some of your services into a different area. In our case, as we move 4R into action around the world, we're starting to do more work on precision agriculture, innovations, Deirdre, you mentioned on big data, precision tools, drone technologies. You know, people talk about self-driving vehicles. Well, we've been doing that for quite a while now in the field. So we're at a point now where those things that you were doing before, because of the SDGs, may tangibly change your business structure in some ways. And we're starting to see that happen in the field as we work in agriculture. The other one that the SDGs does for us, I think, is like I was saying earlier, 1 and 2 is right up our alley. So the whole branding and communicating what we do is much easier now that we have the SDGs. It aligns globally that industries like ours are working with growers around the world, smallholders, developed nation farmers, to actually improve food productivity, improve profitability, improve the quality of food, reduce their impacts on habitat. Those types of things are now easier for us to communicate under a structure that has 17 aligned goals around the world. I think the other one for the branding communication side is just, you know, we mentioned it and saw it in the survey. Well, we focus on a couple of those. It's really quite clear that the ripple effects are quite dramatic. I mean, when we look at some of the Africa smallholder situation we see there, when we improve the poverty, the ripple effect on women empowerment, healthcare, access to medical, improvements in soil quality, those are dramatic changes that change people's lives. So you know, the communication of those impacts is now much easier with that defined structure, with everyone looking in one area. A couple other pieces. We think education's key for us in many ways. So we focus, and Pella, you mentioned Global Hero. We put together an app called Global Hero just to help educate kids that we work with on what the SDGs are. Now we're starting to link SDGs into our whole Journey 2050 education program. So we teach kids how to think about sustainability. They can make their own decisions. They grow crops in Kenya, India, and Canada. They take the profits from growing those crops, and they have to invest in sustainability initiatives, whether it be for healthcare or education or water quality. And once they do that, they start to see that they are having an impact. But we want them to link that to the global SDGs and then give them a way for them to, perhaps in their local community and other areas, contribute to those. We're about to launch another program called Farmers, which will be we hope to reach about 1 million or so children on that one, which will have SDG links in it again and allow the kids to play in a more fun level, if you like, or layered level with 30 levels around the world and trade ideas across Facebook and other areas. The Journey 2050 one, we work with that in schools and curriculum links, so they get to teach them more, you know, appropriately for the teachers. But that's important for us. We have good decision makers out there at the end of the day, better, you know, they make better contributions to society, they make better decisions, and at the end of the day, we can start to partner with more and more players. And one of the last items, and I wouldn't underestimate the value of it, is the whole side of employee retention and recruitment. We see a whole millennial group that wants to work for companies that are doing things that are sustainable, that are making an impact, and how much better is it for us to simplistically show the SDGs linked to sustainability, and here's the impact we make. Every company on the phone today is making an impact. You can do that to show your piece. Ours is more in the ag food side, but clearly you get to see how your impact ripple through the SDGs and actually create this quantitative value. So Helen, with that, I think that's all the major hits I got, so we leave enough time for some good questions and answers if there is some.
Super, thank you so much, Doug. So I'm going to unmute both you, Doug, and also Deidre, and then see if I can move into the discussion. And again, in order to ask questions, raise your hand. I mean, not in the air, but on the small part in the, what do we call that? The chat box, either in chat box or where you can raise your hands. And we will then unmute you and you can ask your questions. So also, and maybe I should have started by saying that, you can tweet about this using the hashtag SDGs for Canada and of course the Global Compact CA. But maybe what I should do is just start in terms, and Deidre, you asked, I think you asked a question in terms of, I think you said, how do you see yourself and how do you see, that you would like to see more companies join? And I could not agree more. We would like to see that as well. We are seeing that. We are actually seeing more and more companies. But clearly, part of this is that the companies that's already joined are the ones that have seen this is important for them. Then you do have, I would say, probably smaller companies, but that is what makes up a lot of Canada, SMEs that might not really have started yet on this journey. And I think the whole thing about finance, and when you talked about Marc-André Blanchette and our ambassador to the UN and his group of friends for the STGs Forum, I think that is, of course, an important part of this. And both Marc-André Blanchette as well as actually Teachers Pension Plan, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, will also be speaking at not the SDG Forum, but the Gender Equality Forum, and about how to finance the future. So just want to take that, and then I think what would be interesting would perhaps look at this thing about partnerships. And as I think Deidre, you were saying, what are the partnerships that can be established? What are the PPPs, private-public partnerships? What is it really that we could see happening both within Canada and on the global, so we really scale? And I think that is important. And some of it is what companies are already doing at the moment, but if we can connect what already happening, we can get so much more out of this. So I don't know, Deidre, if you want to kind of see how you can see both organizations within Canada, the Canadian government, civil society, etc., working together to accelerate action, as we say at our end.
Yeah, well, certainly we see the government as playing a domestic and a global convening role. So bringing together Canadian stakeholders across the SDGs, but also reaching out globally. I mean, I do have a bias sitting here in Global Affairs Canada, so that's where I see our network globally, bringing Canadians together with local organizations, civil society, youth, foundations. And, I was struck as Doug was speaking, that those stories that we're able to tell with results, the value it's bringing to companies, as he was saying, retention, recruitment, branding, that's all good, as well as, the development, the SDG results that he's seeing through his company's actions. We need to be able to tell those stories in developing countries to showcase what Canada's doing, of course, and our branding abroad, but also to bring to life what the SDGs can mean for private sector engagement. And maybe to do a little plug again for the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. It's a new organization or a new forum, and we're trying to make it as concrete and useful as possible. So to allow those success stories or lessons learned, the bad and the good, to be shared, and working across our traditional or comfortable zones. It's not all perfect, our partnerships. I mean, there are how should I put it? We need to force groups together, and we did some of that during our consultations for our international assistance review. Those organizations or types of individuals who may not be talking to each other, but actually had a lot in common, and were able to see what each brought to the table. So I think Canada's got a history of doing that. We're looked to increasingly to build those bridges, and across different types of countries as well. So how we can be inclusive and bring some of those messages on partnerships, but again on specific SDGs like gender equality, like climate change, poverty, how we can push the agenda with that convening role.
Super. And Deidre, there's a question here that came in. Does Global Affairs have a plan how it will measure progress against SDGs? What are the challenges and opportunities to do this? And I know that this could take an hour, so I don't know if you can do that quick.
Yeah. Well, well, first of all, our global support for the Sustainable Development Goals, both from a policy perspective and our international assistance, that's all tied up in our international assistance review that will be coming out in the coming weeks. So there you'll actually see where our SDG priorities are. I mean, I've foreshadowed it a little bit, but clearly the measurement of progress and what results we're getting for our efforts will be a critical part of what we're doing. It's still under development. Measuring progress and showing sort of the value for the money we're spending on international assistance will be key. But sort of linking the domestic and the international, the government of Canada is very committed to showing results. So we are developing that process, and one of the challenges and opportunities is capturing everything that's happening in Canada. I mean, when we are going to be reporting on how Canada's doing on the SDGs, we want to be able to capture not just what the federal government is doing, but municipal governments, provincial governments, our Indigenous peoples, and civil society. So, as I say, it's a huge opportunity, but also a challenge to capture all of that in a meaningful way and to prioritize what we're going to be reporting on.
And I think on that, Deidre, also how do we align that also with the reporting efforts that's going on within both the private sector, but also civil society organization, NGOs, etc. So it all will come together in that regard. Doc, do you want to?
Just something we found, Deirdre, as well, on the measurement and NGO engagement side. Two things. When you have a system that you kind of get alignment on, it starts to make the discussions much easier with whether it be civil society and government or other players, because now you actually have something that's got language around it that's defined. And then what happens next is we've spent a ton of time now saying out of those systems, what are the metrics we can all agree to? Because you have to think through a chain of people, from the farmer in our case, to the retailer, to the food processor, to the grocery store, to the public, and to the NGO that kind of goes right through it. But if you have a system that crosses that value chain with metrics and there that come out of it, then everyone starts to then work together versus one-off projects, where everyone's got a different definition for each project or theme. So we found it's taken us a while, 10 plus years probably, to get that system integrated through, but now we're having much better discussions through the value chain and much better defined metrics that we can wrench into things like the UN SDGs system.
Super. Then there's a Fatma, I don't have my glasses here, Tulia that raised a hand. I'm going to unmute you. At least I'm trying. Am I not?
My apologies, I pressed the button by mistake.
Okay, no worries. But do you have a comment now when you're on?
But thank you. It's a really good presentation. It really helps to see how the whole system is coming and working together.
Thank you so much. Then maybe I should take another question that was sent to us. This one is a little bit long, so here we go. Higher education institutions have a key role to play both in their operations and in their teaching and research. Are there incentives from government, grant funding, to encourage work in these areas, and what are the skills and competencies that businesses need from graduates to mitigate potential skills gaps? So I guess that's a question to both of you. I don't know if Deidre or Doc, who of you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a big question. Obviously, there's a lot happening across the federal government and really the provincial governments in terms of higher education. I know through Global Affairs, we just launched a small leadership initiative. I'll have to get it posted on your Twitter feed, I think, because I'm not going to recall the name of it, but where we're trying to, inspire some small research initiatives in, contributing to sustainable development and the SDGs. But I think the points well taken, and we have been reaching out through Canadian universities to look for partnerships on the SDGs, going out and talking to students. Most recently, while we were together at Humber College, my team was out at UBC, Mount Center, etc., out in Montreal. So reaching out across the country to look for opportunities of collaborating.
Yeah, maybe just adding to that, I think for us, again, it's back to the systems and that consistent approach. As we work with institutions now, for example, let's use climate change with nitrous oxides. Canada actually has one of the larger clusters in the world of researchers in the ag community doing work on that nitrous oxide protocol. It's complicated, but at the end of the day, because of the SDGs and because of our work on that system approach with FOR, we now have researchers in almost every province in the country, with support from Agriculture Canada and our industry, now doing work on identifying how the practices can be made and changed on the ground regionally to reduce emissions for nitrous oxides to address climate change. That sounds small, but it's actually 30, when you start to work on it, when you have companies like Walmart that have probably half of their target of 20 megatons is due to that one area. So we're working with them. I think the other part that happens is when the system does that, we then start to get youth educated on, hey, we need people on the ground working with growers, customizing their best practices, or we need researchers working on precision tools, drone technology, big data management, and on the innovation side. But again, it all links back what we like to a system that we can scale with retailers working with growers across the country and internationally, that we can then iteratively improve and say, well, that worked, that piece of data on precision placement or big data management worked, but we need to fill 2 other gaps with equipment people. So I think to Deirdre's point, it leads to innovation, it leads to funding, because now the government's more in tune or more encouraged to fund because they can see scalable change occurring. And companies are willing to match in because they see opportunities to advance that technology and then in turn actually invest in it for products, services, and with working with their customers. So the system to us becomes core again to moving these things forward. It does create innovation, it does create university opportunities for research and development.
Super. Then another question, we're getting more and more questions in here, so, and less and less time. This question I believe is for you, Deirdre. So given that you mentioned provincial and municipal governments, the question is, I'm wondering how will Global Affairs Canada work with them? So the local, the provincial and municipal governments, are they already speaking to each other to coordinate efforts? Question mark.
So the engagement with sort of provincial governments, municipal, and sort of the broader Canadian constituency for the SDGs will be sort of part of our broader SDG strategy for Canada. So that's still being developed, and it'll be not just global affairs, but the federal government more broadly. So we'll be able to share the specifics soon, we hope.
Super. Then I have the one other question. This is a very, very long question, and so I'm just going to try to condense it. It's basically in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals 8, and is it the economy that come before all the other goals, or is it all the goals that kind of like are integral and being part of? So the question goes, I'm curious if the SDGs are based on the assumption that all global economies should be designed for continuous growth as suggested in SDG 8, and or it's the other way around. I don't know if any of you want to take that question.
Sure, I'm happy to launch. I think that's the elegance and the complexity of Agenda 2030, is that you need to look at the full suite of the goals. That you can't eliminate poverty without economic growth. You need to address things at the city level and gender equality if you're going to have sustainable economic growth. So as I say, it makes it complex, but also sustainable and achievable with a recognition. And it's a step beyond the last set of goals, the Millennium Development Goals. They were nice and clean and tidy, 6 or 7 goals that were basically in the social sphere, and the linkages weren't so obvious. The UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on the SDGs said to me that it's the space between the goals that is the most important part. So it's those linkages. I had one of our consultations was with least developed countries from economic and planning departments, where I met with senior diplomats and ministers, and I was asking, what do you want, or what are you looking for from Canada? And they did point to the economic piece. They do see economic growth as being fundamental for addressing address or achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And they were asking about what can we do to attract Canadian companies, trade, and investment. So that is quite a shift from what we saw under the Millennium Development Goals. So a clear recognition it's not all ODA, and that any one goal alone is not achievable without the others. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, Helen, we would see the same from our experience. I mean, as we worked in some of the projects with smallholders, it's clear, first off, if you can't meet the needs for food security and clean water, sanitation, and those are basics that you must have and take for granted in Canada. Of course, we have problems here with that. But if you start to look at, as it goes to the next layer, you have to have that profitability for that grower. Once that grower has profitability, they can access medical, they can access school, the young girls go to school, there's food programs at school, there's infrastructure that's built in the community. They're able to put things on their ground that improve soil quality. They're able to invest, they're able to intensify production so habitat's not hurt. So that, as Peter says, it's all quite interlinked. There's no doubt if you don't take care of the basics, if you don't have rule of law in some of these nations and places in the world, you cannot get to the other components. So they all have to be thought of in tandem. But we tend to work in places where we have our biggest impact, where we can help with getting the yields, that getting the components, which gives them the food security.
Thanks, thank you, Doc. And just looking at the clock here, so maybe I should start rounding up with the very last question to both of you.
Profitability, hopefully, then work and invest in clean water, education.
Doc, I'm not sure if I think you thought you were done, but I'm not sure if we can actually hear you.
Go ahead, Al.
Okay, sorry. I think we had just a small where we couldn't hear you. Okay, but so far, I mean, I think there's a lot of good initiatives. There's a lot of good insight. My last question to both of you would be: will we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? DRI?
So I was asked this a week ago, and I was the only person in the room that responded yes. And I think the answer is yes. I think we have to remain optimistic. There is, it's not easy. Some people would even say it's not a high enough bar. But I think it's doable. Who would have thought we would have come so far on the Millennium Development Goals 15 years ago? I think the agenda is gaining momentum, and the fact that it's universal has been a game changer.
Doc?
I think we're quite optimistic about the progress to be made. Quantitatively, will you cross the finish line? I don't know if that's as important as making progress, that we can continue to show that we have systems that are going to scale, that we're going to get better every time that we work at it. I do believe that's going to occur. And I think if we do it from a systematic approach, we do it with very strong shared value partnering, we'll get there on those systems. We'll get there on that intersystem development. And then, of course, we'll change the finish line again, and we'll try to improve again.
Great. As you all know, we are all here about accelerating action. And one thing that I cannot leave you all without telling you about is the Gender Equality Forum, where we are zooming in on SDG number 5. And as I think you heard over and over in this webinar, gender equality is one of the ones that both are highest prioritized, but also a base for many of the other goals. So we have a great list of speakers, and I should say that if I were you, I would register if you're not already done it now, because there's not that many seats back. So I would hope to see you in for an action agenda and actually how to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, and in that the Women Empowerment Principles and the SDG number 5. Of course, as you know, the last is ensure that you do have our contacts. When we send out, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and those of you who are not already part of the Global Compact Network Canada, please let us know if you're interested in joining both companies, but I should say we also have great civil society organizations, not-for-profits as well. So that, I think, is the call for action from this side, and I guess we're just on time. I should go to the last slide and say stay in touch, and thank you all so much for staying with us for 1.5 hours, and thank you so much to both Deidre and Doc.
Thank you so much, Helene.
Thank you.
Have a good day all.
Have a good day.